Hello, fellow writers. One last video about our term papers, and this video is going to cover a few points on documentation, which is a place people sometimes have some questions. So just want to make a few remarks about that. So what do we mean when we're talking about documentation? When we use documentation in our papers, in academic papers, we utilize a recognized system to attribute our use of other people's ideas. So one thing we do in our papers is we try to differentiate between ideas that belong to the writer, in other words, ideas that you're presenting as your own, and ideas that you're borrowing from somebody else that help support your ideas or are good observations or help you make the case that you're trying to present. So it differentiates what's original to the writer and it avoids plagiarism. So I'm sure you hear every semester or every quarter something about plagiarism and how this is absolutely something to be avoided. So different academic disciplines have developed different systems. So there are out there, you may not realize this, but there are out there different types of documentation systems. So some examples. And the first example is one that is called Chicago. And this is the standard system that's used in biblical studies. And way back when, even when I was teaching undergraduates for a while, I helped them learn Chicago. And Chicago is basically a system involving footnotes and then a bibliography. So it's the footnote system. And I don't know. Over the years, I I wondered whether helping them learn Chicago was really all that useful. It made maybe for better papers or easier papers to grade, but I sort of relented on that. And now, for many years, I've basically been saying that people can use whatever system they're comfortable with. So in English classes, people use other systems. So there's a system called APA that you might be familiar with. There's a system, getting back to the English classes, called MLA that you might be familiar with. And each of these systems have their own style guides and their own ways of doing things. So MLA in particular is a parenthetical citation. So instead of making footnotes, you have your quote and then you quote the information right there in closed off by parentheses, and then you use a works cited at the end. So it's a different kind of system. It accomplishes the same thing. Ultimately, all of these systems are designed in such a way that somebody who's reading your paper could theoretically go back and find the source that you're citing. So that's sort of the idea behind it, that somebody could go back and verify it or look it up or read more about whatever it is that you're citing in your paper. So these are three common systems. There's links on I posted a link to Fuller's writing page, so you can take a look at some of the various guides there. The sort of condensed Chicago system comes from a guide originally published by a woman by the name of Kate Turabian. So that's kind of a condensed way of doing footnotes and bibliography, or a condensed book. So that's something that's been gleaned from a much larger book called the Chicago Manual of Style. But anyway, you can use whatever style you are associated with. However, you should not invent your own system. And the reason I warn against this is I have had students try to do this before, and I often just can't figure out what it is that they're doing. So do not invent your own system, but use any system that you're already familiar with or comfortable with. If you don't know what to use, then I say use Chicago. And again, there are resources on the posted link that you can refer to. And you can always ask me questions too. So what needs to be documented? Just quickly covering that piece of the puzzle. In general, everything that's not common knowledge needs to be documented, and everything that's not coming from you. So you can borrow things at will that are common knowledge, but anything that's not common knowledge that you're borrowing from somebody else needs to be documented. Now, that's a common knowledge is sort of a tough term, and I like to narrow that a bit because otherwise you could be forced into documenting all sorts of things that would, to my mind, be overkill. So for this course, and here only, so don't carry this over into other courses you might take at Fuller, but we are defining common knowledge as something someone who has taken this course and someone who has paid reasonable attention during the course would know off the top of their head. So something that they wouldn't have to look up, they would just kind of know. So we use a lot of common jargon in this course. We refer to a lot of common ideas. So Levites, the Deuteronomistic history, judges, prophets, and so forth. You don't have to sort of explain where you came up with all those ideas. So for us, who are studying the Bible, and for us in this course, these are things that we commonly know. So we'll say common knowledge is something that we share as a group in our course. And it's also something that does not need to be looked up. So if you're making a very general statement, that Deborah was both a prophet and judge, let's just say that. You could reference that to the Bible. That would be perfectly fine. But that is something that we've talked a lot about and is something that is, I would say, well known. I don't have to kind of pull out my Bible and verify that. Probably no one else in the class needs to pull out their Bible and verify that. So that's what I would say falls under common knowledge. We don't have to look it up. But if you're instead describing some detail of the Jotham story and his sort of prophetic proclamation, that is not something that I have memorized. So don't assume that I've memorized that. And if you're quoting something specific, you would need to reference that. Just by rule of thumb, all direct quotes, by definition, need a reference. So if you're using quotation marks, there has to be a reference there. Now, what about quotes from the Bible? This is a bit tricky because no matter what system you're using, whether you're using Chicago or APA or MLA, quotes from the Bible, I guess because of the Bible's special place in literature and culture, have their own system entirely that overrides whatever system you happen to choose, whatever system you happen to be using. So how does the Bible system of quotation work? So, for example, the Bible has its own system of referencing. If you're using Chicago, for example, you don't footnote the Bible. So the Bible is, I'm not going to count off for this, but really the Bible is never footnoted. So if you're using a system of footnotes, you ignore it for the Bible. So you quote from the Bible in quotation marks, like any other direct quote. So I just pulled a quote out of the book of Judges. So you start off, you put the quote in quotations. If you're leaving out part of the verse, you use this little thing called an ellipsis, the 3 dots. So if you don't want to have to quote the whole passage, you can leave out parts by using that ellipsis. And you can leave it out in the middle of a sentence or at the end of the sentence, so we have them in both places. But whatever part you're quoting, you enclose it in quotation marks. Then it's followed by a biblical reference in parentheses. And there are, so you see it here, Judges 1:9. There are standard abbreviations for books in the Bible. I'm not going to be terribly picky about that, but if you want to look in the Turabian Guide or the Chicago Manual of Style, which are available online, you can look up. There's actually a list of standard biblical abbreviations. Um, Usually, individual verses use the abbreviation. If you're talking about Judges, the book, um, for whatever reason, that is not in italics. That's just in plain text. And if you're talking about a chapter, you actually spell out the name of the book for the chapter. So I'm talking about Judges 13. I would spell out the word Judges and then follow with the Arabic numeral 13. Again, that's super picky. I'm not going to count off for that, but just showing you how it's supposed to happen. And then finally, we follow it at the end by a final period. So your biblical reference, your parentheses, should still be enclosed with a final period. So you don't have to footnote the Bible, just follow this very simple system if you're using a biblical quote. Now, what about something from our class? Something from our class is perfectly fair game. And if you're writing on a topic and somebody else has posted something in the weekly postings that we do that you think is really cool, please feel free to use that. But if you're borrowing it, make sure that you attribute it to them, and you can just do that in a very simple way by using their name and maybe say posting July 15th, 2018, something like that. That'd be perfectly fine. Or if you want to use something I said, again, feel free to do that just by name, and maybe the name of the video in quotation marks is fine, something along those lines, that I know that you know where you're borrowing the idea from. But anything from class is perfectly fine to use. Now, what about outside sources? So now we're talking about not things that have been posted in class or things on a video from class or not from the Bible. What I've mentioned in the prompt is that this assignment is not so much a research paper. Now, you may take other classes where, I don't know, the professor says, I want you to use 5 sources. That means 3 books and 2 journal articles to do your paper. This is not really that kind of assignment. That doesn't mean that outside books and articles are off limits by any means. If you want to do research, you are perfectly welcome to do research, but it's not a requirement of the paper. So I'm much more interested in your interpretation of the text. And we've been practicing week after week doing interpretations of the text, this idea of posing a question and then writing about what we think about that question. That's the kind of thing that I'm looking for in these papers. I'm not expecting you to do a whole lot of outside research, but you are welcome to do that kind of research if you wish. Feel free to use the commentaries, the 2 commentaries that we used in class or other articles that we've used in class, perfectly fine. If you want to quote from other sources or if you want to utilize other sources, make sure they are good sources. This is a perennial problem, and I've struggled with ways to address that. In some classes, I have said, I don't want to see any sources from the internet. And that to me has always seemed really harsh because there's a lot of really good stuff on the internet. Conversely, there's a lot of just There's a lot of bad stuff. There's a lot of not very well thought through stuff. There's a lot of people claiming some sort of level of authority in a blog or a self-written commentary or something like that. Some pastor somewhere has written his ideas about Deborah. I don't know. Um, so I'd rather you avoid those types of sources. They might be good for the application piece of your paper, but for kind of the more academic study of the text, I would rather you not use those sorts of sources. If you find something you really want to use, just send me a text message or email, and I'll give you a thumbs up or thumbs down on whether or not you should be using it. Ask if questions. It's always the common refrain in this class. So, a few final points. You are not writing a commentary on a passage. You are presenting a thesis and you are presenting evidence that backs up your thesis. So, if you are finding that your paper goes verse by verse by verse and you're coming up with sort of disjointed comments about those verses, that is not this assignment. It might be a great assignment in another class, and I've certainly done those kinds of assignments in classes that I've taken, but that's not what we are doing here. Also, you are not, I've had exegesis papers where people have turned in what I would just call a pile of notes, where they've done some research. So this is why one of the reasons we're kind of trying to steer clear of research. They've done some research, they took some notes, they typed them up, and they turned them in. And that, to me, is not exegesis. That is kind of a part of a research paper. So don't do that either. You should have quotes from the Bible. So the Bible is the topic of this class. And if you finish your paper and don't have any quotes from the Bible, I would say you have lost out in some way. You're talking about the Bible so abstractly that you're not pointing to the text in ways that help support your thesis. So you should have quotes from the Bible when you're all done. And finally, you should not rehash the story. So you should assume that I, your primary reader, am already familiar with the story. So don't give me all the plot points of the Deborah story. I already know the plot points of the Deborah story. I want you to present your interpretation of the Deborah story. Anyway, just a little bit about documentation. I hope that clears up any problems that you might have. Overall, you should definitely read the prompt. Seems like every class I teach, there's always one or two people that don't bother to read the prompt. So do read the prompt. And again, if you have any questions, please do ask me. Good luck on your papers and hope things are going well for you so far. Take care.